Yeah.
One of the questions that comes up for me fairly often, particularly when you get into voices, and we've seen conflicts in the world that actually have very ancient roots that reignite from time to time. I mean, like Turks and the Greeks, for example. And you can develop really good relationships, but those fault lines never go away. Kind of, they're always part of the culture. They're part of the lore.
Right.
And I say this in part because, yes, if we got multiple voices, we probably got some negative voices in there too: antagonism, distance, alienation. And in a lot of cases, those negative voices are, for the people who share them, important voices. You don't want to lose the antagonism against the Holocaust. You don't want to lose that negative critical voice because it represents a moral planting of a moral position and a sort of a creation of a hope to create a future in which that can't happen again. So it's an important negative voice to sustain for a lot of people. Okay, now you can cross the bridges at any given time so that we can suspend the negatives and get into the creation of positives. But in some sense, those negatives don't go away. They're always over the shoulder, back there lurking, and always the fault lines exist. And it becomes in some ways sometimes a critique of AI, and that, oh, well, look, we've got all these things that we really want to talk about that's happened, and we want to be heard about these things because they're important to us, and we're not being heard when we go into AI. Is there some way of trying to recapture the negatives in such a way that they don't become lethal, that they lose their punch as eradicating, or become intelligible to those whom they place in question? Places in which they can be heard and legitimized, but without their creating irreconcilable differences.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in AI that says we don't go into whatever these past experiences have been that we might call negative and so on. What it does is raise questions and suspend the idea that that they're real, that they're forever, and just asks us to explore those. But I was working with a group of therapists, big hospital, and they wanted to do an appreciative inquiry, and they said, well, before we do that, we have to get everything out, all of the harsh feelings that we felt with administration and this and that, and what we do is we work towards topics that help appreciate those moments and then help move beyond to what it's going to look like or what it does look like and so on. So we ask people to talk about the most profound moments of real healing that they've ever had, and to draw on those resources. So you know, obviously they went into the pain and went into all the, you know what I'm saying? So that's part of it. The other is, I think you've written about this. It's that the positions may stay there, but what can happen is that through relational practice, doing things together, we're going to create a richer kind of dialogue than frozen positions, And just as an example of that, you mentioned the conflicts that go on and on and on. We're studying organizations, businesses as a force for peace, businesses that are acting as a force for ecological innovation, businesses that are acting as a force for eradicating extreme poverty. And we're seeing these stories, and I think they're just very telling around the role of the pragmatic process of designing the future together. So one of the stories in Rwanda, Bobby Sager, he's a wealthy business leader out of Boston, and he had a place in his heart for Rwanda and a million-person genocide. And he says, how can business be used as a force for peace? We know that the generational dynamics get passed on from one child, and the hatred and the bitterness and fractured feelings and so on. How can we break that cycle, And he wanted to take a less therapeutic approach and said, how can business be used? And it was just wonderful what they came up with in terms of the innovation. They created a micro-enterprise bank, kind of like Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize-winning kind of idea about micro-enterprise loans to the poorest of the poor to jumpstart new businesses. But then they added 2 steps to it. First, it would almost all go to women because so many of the men were killed in the genocides. And secondly, it would go to women who come across the conflict divide. Hutu woman, Tutsi woman coming together with a shared business idea. And what's happening is it's cutting through those cycles of conflict, the children interacting every day, shared, concerns about great education in the community. And so something about getting on with it. And that's why I like this theme of dialogues that deliver. I think in the appreciative inquiry process, the moments that are most transformative aren't the dialogues of discovery, aren't the dialogues of just dream, but it's the dialogues of design and coming together to design together. And when that designing begins to take place, all kinds of things, it's not that they go away, but we transcend and eclipse the old in some sense.
That's what I'd like to believe. But again, there's always this sort of sense of, well, all right, why isn't this happening with the bailout issues today? I mean, what is it that partisan politics inevitably come to play such a major role that even in the design, in such an important time in history, you can't get these people on the same page, even though they both have the welfare of the country at stake, because somehow to let the other side have influence in it would make them look secondary. They can't get beyond the group boundaries, which is somehow control their speech and the way they relate. And there's something about the boundedness of groups and the sanctity of group boundaries that I think is killing, in a sense. That this, in some philosophic sense, it's like looking at the world in terms of nouns, or looking at it in terms of things, with boundaries on them. You, me, chair, people, all of those ways of putting it, which are divisive.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that, because I was thinking about this morning. I was re-looking at your book around social construction and context, and so much of social construction was born in opposition. I mean, tremendous opposition. And let me just, a couple passages from this book. We thus stand at present with a mammoth arsenal of critical weapons at our disposal. The power of such technology is unmatched by anything within the scholarly traditions long standing. There's virtually no hypothesis, body of evidence, ideological stance, literary canon, value commitment, logical edifice that cannot be dismantled, demolished, or derided with the weapons at hand. So it's our own field. And then another part, you say that the means for destroying the other's intelligibility are vast and varied, and sentences might be lifted from context, concepts altered through recontextualization, arguments pressed to the absurd extremes, examples transformed through parody, insidious intentions imputed, and so on. And when I read that, I was thinking about the ads and the political ads and the whole pervasiveness of this. And
our political world operates on much that kind of set of logics or rhetorics, and consequently nothing gets done. And how can we somehow get into that level of decision making with these kinds of ideas? I mean, it's a huge step to be taken. I don't think it's just our government either. I mean, it's like
It's well, and I guess the hope that I have is that these this awareness of how these realities are being constructed, this reflexive capability, is so important. Now, what we do with that, I think, is another thing. I mean, you wrote about the cultural consequences of the deficit discourse and all of that. I mean, what do you see happening in our public life around these kinds of things?
Well, the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of that is to go up against something. Just in the same way I did when I was writing that early work. Go up against the mainstream. Revolt, resist. And we've got to get over that.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons I like so much the kinds of work you're doing.
Yep.
Because it says, hey, look, let's not get into that in the first place. Let's begin to plan something that we can both agree on and drop that. But the conditions for doing that got to be very special.
Right.
And how to understand those conditions so that they could be repeated. How to generate the general consciousness. That is, for example, the people who go through practices like this come out with an awareness of what's happened. That they have together reconstructed something, that these are constructed worlds and we need each other to go on.
Right.
That would be my hope, that this all becomes an educational experience in addition to simply transforming the existing moment.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
That's the optimistic part, I guess.
Yeah. But just, you did talk about how, that social constructionism doesn't mean just opposing everything in logical positivist sense and so on. But it seems like it comes so close. And Suresh raised Marty Seligman yesterday, and we've talked about it a little bit. Share what your thoughts are about the positive psychology science.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, here's a good example. My knee-jerk reaction is much, it's more complicated than that, because I thought the original movement in positive psychology was a very important one in trying to open up a space for looking at more positive things as opposed to just all the diseases everybody had.
Right.
But then when it turned into a science, so that there are going to be some people in lab coats telling you what good life is.
Right.
I like, wait a minute, who's speaking here?
Right.
And what are they telling us? And where are we in that conversation?
Yeah.
And then I go back to the feeling that, as I said last night, that, look, whatever the good is, we're creating it.
Right.
And it can be in many colors, many kinds. And what's good for one can be evil for another, and so on. So we've got to take that into account.
Right.
And as you say, the way in which we can go on co-creating together possibly better worlds than we live in. So at that point, I'm critical of that whole movement. And that critique can be kind of a little bit bitter sometimes, because that movement's just been quite large. But then again, I think, well, look, constructionism isn't about eradicating any positions. It's not about eradicating what people say. It's about trying to strike up conversations so that intelligibilities can be shared.
Right.
So let's recognize what good may come out of that, but recognize its limitations, and let's recognize a conversational context in which we could begin to explore the positives that we could take from each other.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think a paper you once wrote about the wrong revolution in cognitive science and how we could have taken another route with that by realizing cognition and the scientific conceptions and cognitions can change the world. I think the same thing with positive psychology. There's tremendous potential there, but it needs to get unhooked from
that sort of we know base.
Right, exactly.
I need a little bit of Harley and Anderson's not knowing.
Exactly.
A little soup song, that wouldn't hurt.
That's right.
Humility.
That's right.
Where are we in the program? Are we
Wrapping up.
David?
Thanks, Ben.